Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and the mercy of Allah be upon you, and welcome to Hadith Principles. We're studying the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and his importance to us as Muslims, and especially the principles that we need in order to understand the Hadith and apply them, and to verify their authenticity as a source for Islamic teaching. We have our panel here, as usual, brothers. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum. Good to have you guys here, inshallah, today. They are here to support me and help, and they have questions and comments. And inshallah, it'll be of benefit to you guys and to all of us, bi'idhnillah. We've been talking for quite a while about some of the Hadith principles used by the scholars of Islam to authenticate those Hadiths of the Prophet, and also to prevent any interpolation of other statements into the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. A while back, we were talking about some of the definitions, and we talked about the difference between Sunnah and Hadith. And in fact, somebody talked to me and showed me some information that is circulating out there. And it has its origin in the idea of the Orientalists in a previous era and modern secular scholars who study Islam from a historical point of view, but of course aren't actually faithful or practicing Muslims. But this kind of information spreads, and it can put confusion in people's minds. And that is because we've tried to show people the importance of following the Prophet Muhammad and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. And so the basic idea is there's a difference between the Sunnah and the Hadith. And that originally the Sunnah was something different, and the Hadith is something that came later on. And the way this argument goes is that initially the Sunnah was passed down from the companions to the Tabi'een in a practical form, and that in each community they practiced the Sunnah. And then later on, the Imams based their fiqh on the Sunnah of their community. So Imam Abu Hanifa based his fiqh, or his jurisprudence, on the practical application of the Sunnah, or tradition of Kufa in Iraq. And Imam Malik based it on the Sunnah of Medina, the people of Medina. And then later on, Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmed, they tried to introduce the Hadith. And people started using the Hadith instead of the Sunnah, according to this theory. And this is very dangerous, because what this will do is basically say that we are following the Sunnah, we're just not following the Hadith. And so, as we said, that in Islam, Allah commanded us, "Ti'ullah wa ti'ur Rasul," that we have to obey Allah and obey the Messenger. And the Prophet said, "Alaykum bi sunnati," you must obey my Sunnah, you must follow my Sunnah. So in this way, in an underhanded way, they could destroy the validity of the Hadith and still claim that they are following the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. And they give us evidence that Abu Hanifa, in his opinions and fatwas, in many cases that are well known, gave an opinion different than something that is found in a Hadith. And there are many examples of that. So in the Sunnah, in the Hadith, of course, we know that when two people engage in a financial transaction, a bay', and they agree upon something, that as long as they're still in that same location together, which is called al-majlis, then until they depart, they have the option to go back on the deal. But after they depart, the deal becomes final. And this is preserved to us in the authentic Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so this is a condition in buying and selling as Muslim, that you have the option to change your mind while you're still together. And so the deal is final when they separate and go to a different location. So I'm in your shop, and then I depart and leave. Now the deal is final. And so Abu Hanifa didn't follow that, because he saw, in his opinion, ways that could be misused. Like, for example, we could be on a boat together for months, so we would never be able to make any deal. Or a famous example, that the spoils are divided among the soldiers who are volunteering in the war. The foot soldiers get one share, and the soldiers who have provided their own horse or camel as their mount, they get 2 shares, because they have brought their mount. And so Abu Hanifa, radiallahu anhu, said, I won't consider the Muslim to be equal to an animal, a horse or a camel. So I won't take, the camel gets 1 share and the Muslim gets 1 share, you see. And so there are many famous examples in the fiqh of Abu Hanifa. But Abu Hanifa did not deny the hadith. In fact, Abu Hanifa quotes many, many hadith in his opinions, but he has his fiqh in his ijtihad. And his ijtihad was based on particular circumstances and his opinions of how to apply Islam in a particular situation. They also give the example of Imam Malik, that he often didn't follow a hadith, but he followed what is called Amal Ahl al-Medina, the actions of the people of Medina. And so the opinion of Imam Malik was that since so many Sahaba lived in Medina, the Prophet lived in Medina and all the Sahaba lived there, and then the people of Medina passed down many, many customs. So for example, each community had measurements, or sa'a, by which they would measure for zakat al-fitr, the charity given at the end of Ramadan. And so they felt that their sa'a was from the Sahaba, and so the people of Medina felt theirs was accurate. And they would pass down customs, just as we learn prayer by seeing, not by maybe we heard a hadith, but somebody taught us. So they passed down these things directly from the Prophet ﷺ. So that was the opinion of Imam Malik. But of course, Sahaba lived also in Kufa, and Basra, and Fustat, and Dimashq, and they lived in every part of the world. But of course, in Medina, there were many great scholars, but there are also scholars in Mecca and in every other part in Iraq and every other part of the Islamic world. And so Imam Malik himself quotes the hadith, and he wrote the hadith. And so obviously the hadith were familiar. Imam Malik was born in the 1st century. He met the 2nd generation Muslims who met the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He narrated them on very short isnads. And so the hadith were, without doubt, known to both Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik. And so the sunnah means both of those things. The way that the Muslims following the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in each community, they followed the Prophet, they learned from the Sahaba, and they passed that down. But when they heard a direct hadith from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they didn't reject that, unless they had a reason that they believed there was a particular reason that they would not follow that. Maybe they thought the hadith was not authentic, or it was forged, or they were not aware of that hadith, or they felt that the circumstances in their particular community were different. And so, as we said, the hadith are the narrations of the Prophet's actions and words, what he approved, what that was done around him, as well as his description. All of those things are the sunnah. And the hadith is the text that tells us the sunnah. And without doubt, you might find the hujjiyah, or the authority of Ahl Medina, but also the people of Mecca, and the people of Kufa, people of Fustat, people of Dimashq. They all knew the Sahaba, and they all passed down the teaching of the Sahaba. And so there are different opinions, but none of those things are proof that any of those ulama rejected hadith. And when a scholar rejects one hadith, and he accepts another, what does that prove? Does that prove that the hadith are not the sunnah? It proves the opposite. It proves that the scholars use their criteria, their principles, to authenticate hadiths, and then they apply them. And so Abu Hanifa applied hadiths, and sometimes he gave reasons why he didn't apply a certain hadith. And Imam Malik applied the hadith. And so they proved the opposite of that claim against the sunnah. And also, of course, people say that when people become involved in the hadith, then they do not follow the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. It's so extreme that one person in America who immigrated to America from a Muslim country, he was telling them We can't say sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessing be upon him. And we can't say La ilaha illallah, there's none worthy of worship but Allah, Muhammad Rasulullah. Because we're putting the Prophet's name next to Allah's name as their equal. So we only say La ilaha illallah. This is how far and extreme they went. They say we only follow the Quran. And they're not following the Quran at all when Allah said in the Quran, Inna Allah wa malaikatuhu yusalluna ala nabi. Allah and His angels greet the Prophet with and bless the Prophet with peace. And so the hadiths describe for us what to do that if we bless the Prophet Muhammad, Allah will bless us, and that's worth 10 times. And so the Sunnah explains to us the meaning of the Quran. And the Sunnah adds supplementary knowledge that is not found in the Quran at all. And so the people who claim that they are following the Quran and they're not following the Sunnah or the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ are not actually following it at all. And we gave many examples of that in previous episodes. We're going to go for a break, and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
The tension there, what about the North Korean nuclear program and the six-party talks? How will the tension there affect a relationship between US and China?
They did that early in 1993, and after long discussion and negotiation, finally they stopped the program.
Will the world be able to stop this flow of secrets? Will it affect international relations? Or were there simply basic known facts for most experts and most diplomats?
And we don't know if there's more to come. It's information war.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hadith Principles. We're trying to clarify some of the misconceptions about the relationship between the Sunnah and the Hadith. And that in fact, following the Sunnah is following the Hadith, and following the Hadith is following the Sunnah. They're basically two words that are used to mean the same thing. Of course, in Islam, we also say in fiqh, this action, like using the miswak before wudu, is sunnah. That means that is the way of the Prophet Muhammad, but it means, in addition to that, it means it is recommended. It's a recommended practice, a mandub practice, or mustahab, a highly praiseworthy action that is rewarded by Allah if you do it, but you are not punished if you disobey it. It's not a sin if you don't do that particular action. So we call that a sunnah. And of course, those things are found in the Quran also. There are things in the Quran that are recommended that are not obligations, as there are things in the Hadith or the Sunnah that are obligations. So there are, a little bit of confusion among people, and Muslims use terminology, and sometimes they don't all understand it completely. I don't know if you guys agree with that or if you've observed that yourselves among people. And a lot of sincere Muslims, especially, for example, in the West, are really confused about that. And I've met highly educated people, PhDs and doctors, who have very little knowledge and understanding of this. And so what they basically said is, all these controversies and arguments just confuse me, so I just ignore it. And that is really the wrong attitude. We really need to educate ourselves. And so when you hear controversies, that's why you need to investigate with an open mind, inshallah.
Mm-hmm. Some say that growing your hair is sunnah. Is that true?
What?
Growing your hair?
Growing your hair?
Yeah.
Well, in Islam, the fiqh of these things, the Islamic law has different levels. And the highest level are the essentials that must immediately be applied in any society to protect our faith and our religion and our families and property and the dignity of every individual. And the next level is the hajiyat that are requirements basically for our daily life, to be successful, like buying and selling and trading and all the things that are necessary. You have to have an economy, you have to have law and order, you have to have a system in place in order for society to be successful. And the third level is tahsiniyat, which are the beautification of Islam. That Islam is a beautiful culture and expression of the wisdom of Allah and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And so things about our appearance are of that third level. That is, to have an attractive appearance based on Islamic criteria. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ grew his hair. He didn't cut it very short. He didn't normally shave his hair, except for in Hajj and Umrah. It's allowed, of course, to shave your hair, but it's not recommended to be excessive in doing those things. Those are signs of sometimes extremists, that they always either shave their hair very short or they keep their hair very long. And so Islam is, encourages moderation, not making your hair in strange styles like people make. Their hair is sticking up in funny ways, or part of it's real short, or part of it's real long. And because it's supposed to be attractive, not and respectable, not bizarre and the sign, cause fear in children and small animals.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
If you please clarify and shed more light about or on the importance of the Sunnah in fiqh.
Well, of course, the Islamic fiqh is the practical application of Islam. Islam is not simply a book, the Quran or the Hadith that you read, but it's a way of life. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, came and lived Islam, and the Sahaba lived it. And they used their minds to understand its principles and apply them in their lives. And so that is the reason for Islam to be on the earth, is for us to live it and apply it. And so the Sunnah is the example, living example of the Prophet putting Islam into practice. So we have to read it with that intention, that it's an important part of our lives. And so the jurisprudence is how we practice Islam, using the tools of Islamic scholarship to take it off the shelf and make it a living, breathing thing, so that people come and they see Islam practice. As the Arab Bedouins came to Medina and they saw the life of justice in Medina and the kindness and gentleness and the beautiful character and example of the Prophet and his companions, and they embraced Islam. And so Islam became a living model of a civilization, and that civilization became one of the great civilizations of history. And so the Sunnah, of course, is essential. It's by consensus. All Muslim scholars, in all the eras from the Sahaba, the next generation, Tabi'een, the Imams, the great Imams of Islam, and all of them agreed about the Sunnah. And only the most extreme heretics ever disagreed about that, and they normally didn't practice the Quran or the Sunnah. And in fact, you will find that people who claim they're following the Quran don't practice anything at all.
I have another question, please.
Yes, no problem.
Does the Sunnah requires or needs interpretation?
It needs people who have a lot of familiarity with the wording. They have to understand the cause, what was going on, what was the situation. Was that in Mecca or Medina, before the migration or after the migration? They have to understand whether things are commandments or recommendations or simply descriptions of ordinary things of the culture that are not applicable to us today. They have to, of course, be able to distinguish authenticity of things. And so you need people who have scholarship and study of the Hadith to interpret for us and explain. It's not enough for us to open up a book and we read something and we think we know what it means and then apply it. In fact, you might do more harm than good. Sometimes they say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yes.
And so previous generations, Muslims would never say about Allah or the Messenger anything without knowledge. They would say, I don't know, Allahu A'lam. Even our greatest scholars and imams. And so it's better for us to say we don't know, rather than make up something that we think when we read something in a book somewhere. We need to seek out experts in the field who can help us and guide us and teach us in these matters, inshallah.
I have another one, please.
Okay, well, let somebody else, then we'll come back to you, inshallah.
Yes,
Hassan.
okay.
It's something revolving around the knowledge, gaining knowledge. How do we stay on the safe side when there's so much information out there and it could lead us into extremism where we say there's so much information, I'm not going to follow anything, and the other side, you get into all these...
Well, Islam is, the middle path Al-wasatiyya is one of the great principles of Islam. And wasatiyya means fairness and justice. It means when you hear different arguments, you examine their evidence, you don't judge things immediately. First, you have to educate yourself on the basic principles that we use in Islam, the principles of application, the usul. The usul are our foundation. What are our basic beliefs, and then how do we apply them in fiqh, in practice? And so you have to have a foundation starting with the usul that are consensus, they're agreed upon. The Quran and Sunnah, there's no controversy about either of those. The basic beliefs of Islam, the basic practices. You learn those and educate yourself. And you read the Quran and Sunnah using the guidance of qualified people in tafsir and in hadith and in fiqh to guide you, and then be confident that, inshallah, you have a mind, and Allah made this deen yusr, and the religion is easy to understand if you will be sincere, inshallah. And it's usually when people are following their emotions, not their reason, that they are led astray. And so they have hatred for people and envy, and that leads them to fighting and disputing, inshallah.
Can you explain, because there's a lot of ignorance about name calling, can you explain what a Wahhabi is?
Because you're right, I did use that term previously. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was an Islamic scholar who lived in Arabia more than 200 years ago, almost going on 230, 40 years ago, and who basically called to the Islam of the Quran, the Sunnah, the Imams, Imam Bukhari, and other scholars. People have associated, they use this word actually, when people try to come into a society and they force people to practice Islam in a harsh way, they say that's a Wahhabi. Or when people don't follow one of the Imams, one of the four Imams, they say that. And actually, Imam Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, he actually followed one of those four Imams, but he used his own mind, his ijtihad, and he also followed that, as other great scholars have done. And so it's just used as a term of approbation that people who they don't like somebody who's strictly practicing the religion, they will just call them that for some reason. And so it actually has no basis. It's actually, of course, Wahhab is one of the names of Allah, that He is very generous, who has given us everything as a gift from Allah Almighty. And so there's nothing wrong with that person. He was a good Muslim scholar. May Allah Almighty guide us to the understanding of the Quran and Sunnah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by his sunnah and the Quran, the word of Allah. He brought the answer to this cruel world, our beloved Prophet Muhammad.